Live with Miami's Community News, and I'm Michael Miller. Our very special guest today from the Cuban Studies Institute is Jaime. I want to make sure I get your last name correct. Suchlicki?
That's good.
That's good. Congratulations.
We should end it now.
Okay. So, Jaime, first tell us a little bit about yourself and then about the Cuban Studies Institute. Why did you start it, and what does it mean to all of us here?
Well, I've been involved with Cuban studies since I arrived in Miami back in 1960. I was a professor at the University of Miami for 50 years.
How many?
50.
50. That's way older than Rochelle, who's producing the show today. For 50 years, Rochelle, so.
And I just retired about 5 years ago, and I wanted something to continue doing what I was doing. So I created a small institute, Cuban Studies Institute, which is basically a research. We don't do any teaching. We do primary research, and our major project right now is a database of Cuban Americans, the history of the group, who are the principal leaders, biographies, what are their contributions, what are their ideas, and that's what we.
For people that are over the age of 40, 50, 60, we understand how important that is, that you can create an environment where the young people, when we're long gone, be able to go, oh, let's go see what happened before, because we know how important that is for all of us to understand where we are at and where the universe is at. So let's talk about some of the, you wrote a piece called The Growing Russian Threat. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Tell us about that.
Well, for a long time, we've been concerned, and I have been concerned about the Russians' interest in Cuba, their involvement with Cuba, and their opposition to U.S. policy. Something has happened recently that has given us some major concern, which is the Russians have sent submarines to Cuba. One, to prop up the Cubans, two, to gather intelligence, but third, primarily, to lay down missiles in the waters of Cuba on the ocean floor. And that's the latest thing that we are concerned, and we've gotten intelligence out of Russia that the Russians are putting silos in the sand on the coast of Cuba, and then putting in missiles on the silos, which if they can be launched from Cuba or they can be launched directly from Russia. If that were to happen, we would have a major conflict between Russia and the United States. But the question is, where are the Chinese? And the Chinese and the Russians are now working very closely on the question of Cuba. So if the Chinese were to get involved in this little venture of putting missiles on the Cuban floor and launching it at some point against the United States, we would have a world war.
So 1941, I believe, we never thought that another country would bomb us. And so and it's like, oh, no, that'll never happen. All right. And in this case, the capability of those missiles can essentially probably hit at least half the country right off the bat.
Not only that, if their thinking is to cripple the economy of the United States, it would launch the missiles against the Gulf Coast, where the major petroleum refineries are. And if the Chinese were joining, they would attack California and the West Coast. So that would paralyze the economy, not necessarily the military. The military would respond, but the economy and the psychic of the American people will be a disaster.
Well, we learned a lot of lessons with COVID, a lot of lessons, and how when the supply lines got interrupted, the grief that it caused. And we can see, if you're a bad guy, there's so many options for them to do this. So what is it that the Russians and the Chinese want to do with doing that work down there with the missiles? What do they want to accomplish?
Well, I think they wanted to get leverages, first of all. I mean, having missiles near the United States and in the waters of Cuba gives them a tremendous leverage over the United States, because the U.S., number one, has to move all of their equipment south, looking toward Cuba. That is costly. It's a continuous process of watching what Cuba is doing. So from the Russians' point of view, this is important, and it gives them a lot of leverage vis-a-vis the United States. And that's where we are. And if they're working together with the Chinese, then it creates a major concern, like we are concerned about China and...
So you're a couple years older than me, and probably been following world politics for a lot longer than
a couple of years older.
So has it always been similar to this? I mean, in the last 50, 60, 70 years?
Yeah, on and off. It depends on who was in power. When Trump was in power, the Russians stayed away. They decided not to challenge Trump and so on. With Biden, they see him as a weak sister. They see him as a guy that never been tough on the Russian. So they're pushing. And my concern is that as we get toward the end of the Biden era, they may push harder. So I hope not.
Well, we understand there's a balance in life, all right? And so the tide comes in, the tide goes out. So hopefully in between those things that we can all live a peaceful life.
Right.
So again, so tell us, if you would, on back to the Institute, some of the writings and some of the videos that you have. So somebody that's watching, a young person, could say, "Gee, if I go over there, this is what I can see." And how does your work get funded?
Well, first of all, you can buy most of our stuff. We have it on sale either through what's the name? The company that sells them.
I don't know, Amazon?
Amazon.
Yeah, that small company.
Amazon. Or you can...
Michelle, did you hear that? Okay.
Or you can buy directly from the Institute. We have videos about the history of Cuba, and we have all kinds of historical work. I wrote a book called Cuba from Columbus to Castro. So that's available both in English and Spanish. The second part of the question was what?
Actually, at this point, I forgot. This is good. Where's Mike Carricart when we need him? Mike, where are we at? So it was really so that young people can see what can they find in there as far as something very specific, as far as about some history.
Well, the history of Cuba has not been written, or has been written with different points of view. I'm hoping that mine is fairly balanced. It shows why there was a revolution in Cuba, what did that revolution do, why it has lasted so long, and what is the future in case of a change. Where would Cuba be and go? So
I forgot his last, Tony Bryant. Tony Bryant walks in the door about 15 years ago, and he says, "Hi, I'm Tony Bryant." I go, "The Tony Bryant?" And he goes, "Yes." I said, "The one that hijacked that plane?"
Yeah.
Yes. So we worked together for a while. He wrote a book called Hijack. And when I was reading that a weekend, I read it in the weekend, and you see what was going on in those prisons and what they did to people and still are. I think it's important for people to understand that, whether they from your book or from the history, so that we know what that was like, and probably still. But if you could push a magic button and you say, here's what's going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years in Cuba and in the United States relationships with them, what might that look like?
Well, it's difficult to predict because everybody has been predicting that the end
this
of
is the year he's going down. That's why I don't have these fingers.
Yeah. So I don't want to predict that it's going to happen soon. But eventually Cuba will move away from the relationship with Russia and will normalize somehow a relationship with Cuba. May not be a drastic change, although it could be, but it may be a gradual change. Cuba is going to need a lot of help, economically, intellectually, you name it, to get back into the normal situation. So it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be long-term. is going to be complicated. There's a whole generation that has grown under communism. I don't know how they're going to react. Many of them will continue to leave Cuba and come to the U.S. Some of them will stay. I don't know that many will return to Cuba if there is a change from the United States.
So the United States and the banking system just changed the rules. Please explain what it means as far as Cuban businesses banking with the United States.
Well, this is an unusual measure for the United States to provide access to American banking to a communist regime who for 50 years has been an enemy of the United States. So it's going to give him access to money. It's going to give him access to the U.S. market. I don't know that it's going to change anything in Cuba. And this is a regime that is entrenched, that has its own views of the world, that hates the United States. So I don't see the Cuban regime modifying its behavior because we allow them to bank in the United States. Maybe it's a olive branch from the Biden administration to Cuba in the hope that things will moderate a little bit, especially with the elections in the U.S., and that we can influence somewhat Cuban development. I doubt it. Cuba is not influenceable.
So 25 or 30 years ago, I forgot the young man's name. He was rescued off the coast, and he was brought to the United States, and that the father wanted him back. The mother had died. What was the young man's name then? Do you remember his name?
Oh, yeah, I remember very well.
Yeah, refresh it so it triggers in my brain. What was his name? Yeah, that guy, the young kid. It caused such, because of what occurred, it caused a huge division here in Miami-Dade County. And I still have pictures on US 1 and the vitriol, the anger,
well,
and
the
hate.
majority of the Americans felt that the child should be returned to Cuba because they should be with his parents and so on. The majority of the Cubans felt that we should keep the child here and not send him to Cuba because it was a communist regime, because it would indoctrinate him, because he wouldn't be free there. So it was a totally division.
How is it that this one person, this one child, all of a sudden supersedes all the noise on this for decades?
It polarized this community.
It was crazy. I live off of Bird Road, and the honking that was going on all the time, Tropical Park that was crazy over there, and it was unbelievable. And it made people just bubble with this anxiety and this grief and the potential racism that might be in their hearts that kept bubbling up, and then to have to deal with it. Everybody had their own opinion on it, one side or the other. And some of the best pictures that I've ever seen came from that raid when the army or the police went in and took the baby.
With a machine gun.
Yeah, it was some great pictures. That young man is now in political office.
Yeah, Elian Gonzalez.
Yes, yes, and amen. Okay, and the Cuban people put him high esteem, even though the boy had nothing to do with it.
The Cuban people used him. And the Cuban government has used them to show American imperialism and that Cuba is better and that we bring up this kinds of leaders of the revolution. The kid is a colonel, I think, in the military now and has a fairly decent position. Nothing's important, but hey.
It's interesting how we made this little boy, had nothing to do with it, into this thing and just holding him in high esteem. It wasn't something that he did. It wasn't something that he earned.
He didn't do anything.
It's just, hey, right? And when you think of the story where how he was rescued, you say, oh, this is terrific. And so back then, it would be hard to have a conversation with people without that subject.
Oh, yeah, they were very emotional.
Yeah, and it was just like, oh, my goodness. I remember I stopped talking about it. And we have pictures all up and down US 1 with the terrible flags that people were flying. And, whatever the conversation was, it was just horrible. And so we are certainly glad that that is over and that we each are dealing with, how we feel about these things. when I was right around 1960, 61, 62, and I remember saying to my father, how is it these people come from Cuba and in a couple of years, man, it looks like they own banks and cars and they got these jobs. And he explained to me back then, he said, Michael, when people immigrate, those are the people that want more. They're willing to work harder to do all those things.
True, is the upper and middle classes of Cuba. In other words, the poorer Cubans came too, but those that didn't progress as quickly. But if Cubans had experience in business, Cuba was a progressive country in terms of Latin America, with a lot of banks, a lot of businesses, a lot of radio stations, and so on. So the Cubans that came here felt well in this kind of a society and the ability to progress and do well here. So
God bless him, Carlos Alberle, I'm sure you remember him from, I forget, Fidelity Bank. He was a gentleman's gentleman. He was so involved in Boy Scouts. And he had an assistant, I forget his name. He was the first Cuban on Channel 4. And Channel 4, they almost took him, it got crazy that people didn't want Cubans on the air. And this was his assistant. And I have to give kudos to the bank. And when Carlos was here one day, not Carlos, the other gentleman, I said, we need your help. He said, what do you need? I said, we need some ads. He went to the bank and got ads and gave it to us. The day it was printed, he came over, got a bill, went to the bank, and brought back checks. Because he understood the struggle of being in business. And so my hat's off to them. 40 years later, they made a difference, to us. And because of that, it made a difference to our readers.
The banks opened the doors to a lot of Cubans in the construction business, in restaurants, in any business that they want to open. The Cuban says, here's the money. Go do it. So there was that
was very deliberate on that part. It wasn't just happen chance.
Yeah.
Well, that was wonderful. And so here we are, 2024. Right. Half the year is already gone. All right. So tell us about what's on your plate for the rest of 2020.
The most interesting part is still to come.
Yes.
What's going to happen in November?
Yes.
Well, basically, I'm going to continue with the Institute. I don't know for how long. I'm a little old now. I'm 84. I'm a child, sure. And so, and it's become more difficult to raise funding. Up to recently, there were, I would say, a group of Cubans that supported Cuban things and were interested. And you go and ask for a donation, they wrote you a check. Now, it's more difficult. There is interest in Cuba, but it's not interest in supporting things Cuban. You want to know what's going to happen. You want to know if there's a good restaurant. But beyond that,
that's why it was important. The work you've done is so important, because at some point, the people that cared no longer care because they got other stuff like staying alive.
And the kids grew up and they're interested in Cuban music and Cuban food, but they're not interested in history or what happened in the island.
So for the people that live outside Miami, many miles away, maybe they don't understand. A lot of these Cubans come over on very small boats. It's crazy. I remember going to a restaurant off of Bird Road, and the boat wasn't much bigger than this table, and they had it parked out there. You didn't have to tell me what it was about. I got it figured out. People risk their lives to get in that boat and they come across the straits, Florida Straits, and come over here and looking for new chances and new hopes. And so, I know there's some people that complain about it, all right? But the reality is they come here because they want a better life and to produce and to give back to the community. And we see that consistently. And so I'm very happy with the changes that the immigrants, wherever they're from, have made here. Because if it was left to the old white guys, you know what would happen? I won't say it out loud, but you know exactly what it is.
We produce a 27-minute video of the history of Cuba, narrated by Andy Garcia. He volunteered to do it. We wrote the script, and we produced it. Let me tell you,
we have 30 seconds.
We sold thousands of copies of that thing. Everybody wants it because they put it in the machine. They show it to their kids.
Can they get that on your site? On the website. So there we go. We got up on the thank you, Rochelle, for doing that. The website's up on the website's on the show right now. It's CubanStudiesInstitute.us.
Yeah.
And people can find out more about you and more about the Institute and how they can contribute either buying products or making direct donation. Jaime,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. God bless you. Folks, thank you for tuning in. And Michelle, thanks for producing the show. Remember, folks, take care of yourselves.